Welcome to Mrs. Nightmare.
I did some research on art and animation styles and learned that this technique was known as hyperrealism, a style intended to give intense, lifelike detail using traditional, non-digital art methods. Some pieces of this genre were almost undistinguishable from photographs. The lion wasn't quite that realistic. You could still tell easily enough that it was a cartoon, yet it was somehow as visually striking as a real photo of a lion. I continued my research, now focusing on finding people who were knowledgeable about this art form. I narrowed my search down to a few academics and animators and emailed them the lion still. I got a response from one expert saying the style reminded him of Jonathan Strobel, an Austrian artist and animator who had moved to the United States in the 1930s. He had worked for Disney briefly before starting his own animation studio. He was known for his bizarre, deconstructionist approach to animation and had started his own small anti-art movement of sorts. Animators and cartoonists that trained at his studio produced their own bizarre works, which often included violent and grotesque themes, despite the fact that the studio ostensibly marketed to children. The email went on to explain that Strobel became increasingly obsessed with magic and the occult during his career. He became less and less functional until his studio was forced to close due to bankruptcy. Curiously, the studio was known to produce only a handful of original works of its own. Apparently, the animators had spent a lot of time deconstructing and replicating the works of other companies, mainly Disney, since they were the only major animation studio at the time, and altering them to make them surreal or disturbing. This would have opened the company up to piracy claims, except that they never sold such works to the public, instead gifting them to a handful of collectors within the anti-art elite community. Strobel also had self-published a book, a manual of sorts, which contained prints of some of his still cartoons and instructions on his technique. It was simply titled Animation Deconstructed. I immediately determined to read it, but it took me ages to find a copy. I managed to track one down at a public library headquarters 3 states away. The book was in their special archive collection, so I couldn't get it through interlibrary loan. I had to drive there, where they would allow me to examine it in their archive reading room. The room was sparse, dusty, and poorly lit. It had the feel of a 1950s police interrogation room. I was allowed to read the book of interest at the single table under the supervision of a librarian. It was yellowed, and the jacket was wrapped in protective plastic. The volume was short enough to read in an hour. Strobel was not as good at English as he was at drawing, so the self-published aspect really showed in the numerous grammar errors. There were a couple dozen prints in the book, all made in his unique hyper-realistic style. Again, they weren't photorealistic like other artists in the genre, but he had depth of detail and perspective that made them appear alive all the same. None of them did anything paranormal or anything like that, but there was one that managed to seriously frighten me. It was a cartoon snake, a cobra, with its fangs bared and a menacing look in its eyes. You know how some paintings of people have the eyes painted in such a way as to give the impression of the subject's gaze following you as you view it from different angles? Well, this piece didn't do that, but it had some similar thing going on, where the eyes of the snake appeared to bore right into you, straight through the page. I felt like the snake was going to strike up and dig its fangs into my arm. I didn't have a trippy experience like with the lion animation, but it was still surreal and unnerving. In addition to sections on art technique, Strobel had also included a number of seemingly randomly placed critiques of the state of animation that could generously be described as educated rants. A frequent target of his criticisms was Walt Disney, whom he decried as an amateur buffoon who was holding back the animation medium from its true potential. The author went on to emphasize the need to be bold and daring in animation and willing to push social taboos. I returned the volume to the librarian. I hadn't discovered anything that would help me with my search for the Aristocats tape, but at least I had come away with some interesting insights into the philosophy of the man who may have been behind it all. My next step was to visit Strobel's studio, which involved yet another cross-country road trip. I started to wonder how much gas money I would end up spending by the end of my search for this damn video. Was it really cheaper than flying? At least the studio was still standing, though I had arrived anticipating that anything of major interest would have been looted decades ago. Still, I held out hope as I pulled into a shopping center parking lot. The rest of my journey would have to be on foot, since the studio had predated modern roads. I crossed the interstate, there being only light traffic, and found and followed the old dirt road that would have been the sole source of vehicle traffic back then. By now, it was largely overgrown, and I cursed myself for not bringing a machete. It took me 2 hours to reach the location. It was a 1-story wooden building with its windows boarded up and foliage growing all around it. I walked the perimeter, looking for a way in that wouldn't open me up to charges of breaking and entering, though I seriously doubted anyone would ever know or care that I had been here in any case. To my disappointment, no entryway had been left by previous urban explorers, and I had to hack away the boards of one window with a hatchet I had brought. It may have been easier to smash down the door, but that felt somewhat less ethical. There was of course no source of light except the now open windowway, but I had the foresight to bring 3 high-powered LED lamps in my backpack, which I now set up around the floor, relieved that I did not see anything scurrying or slithering. The place seemed smaller on the inside, barely more spacious than my basement at home. There was no furniture except a couple broken easels on the floor. They probably sold off all the tables and desks to pay off their debts, I thought. Some scuff marks were visible on the wooden floor. There was a low wooden partition that sectioned off a small segment of the room. I guessed that this is where the administrative desk had been, while the rest of the floor was used for the actual animation work. Like I said, I hadn't really been expecting to find anything important, but it was still disappointing. I spent the next couple of hours pacing the floor, wondering if the whole trip had been a waste of time and mileage. I was about to pack up my lamps and leave when I discovered the trapdoor behind the floor partition. I had taken one of the lamps off the floor to perch it on top of the partition, and the light now allowed me to see the outline of the trapdoor, along with its hinges and latch. The door was about 3 feet by 2 feet. I grew excited and opened it. Annoyingly, the door did not appear to have a mechanism for staying open, and was too heavy for me to hold up. I had to go back out through the window and back in several times just to bring some rocks in to prop it up. But the contents of the compartment were worth it. The compartment was about 3 feet deep and contained what looked like diagrams for animation or film devices, along with various little parts, knobs, bolts, lenses, and the like, all scattered at the bottom. I studied these with fascination, but couldn't make heads or tails of the schematics. I tried fitting some of the parts together, with no success. I decided against taking these items with me. I had rationalized that violating the law by entering this place unlawfully was worth pulling back the curtain on whatever had caused my childhood trauma. But these items were unlikely to be of value to that end, and thus stealing them for my own curiosity would go beyond the bounds of that justification. However, I did photograph each one of them, just in case. Part 7. The next few months were uneventful. Once again, I felt like I had hit a dead end, and I took a break from the mission and focused on life obligations. I had just managed to comfortably put the lost episode search on the back burner and feel contented when I received an email with the subject, "What you've been looking for." I hesitated a good few minutes before opening the message. "Hello. If you want answers, meet me at this address and time." My heart raced. This email wasn't from any of the addresses I had messaged. I instinctively felt I was about to finally get closure and was suddenly terrified. Perhaps even more terrified than I had been at any point before in this journey. More than when I was run off the road. More than when I was hypnotized by a cartoon lion. More than when I had been threatened through the TV in a motel room. My hands were shaking so much I could hardly use the keyboard to navigate to a new tab and look up the address. It was an empty lot from an abandoned building that had been razed years ago. The Google Maps street view looked somewhat foreboding, but it was within comfortable driving distance of my apartment, which terrified me even more to realize the sender knew which city I lived in. Still, I asked off work for the specified date and was racked with dread until it arrived, barely able to concentrate on my job. And I drove to the lot 3 hours ahead of time, parking my car in the street, as was typical for the neighborhood. It was a sunny spring day, and the wind made me uncomfortable, despite the warm weather. Each passing car made me apprehensive, particularly the ones that appeared to slow down. I had an overwhelming urge to drive away as the appointed time drew near. When the car stopped at the lot exactly at the time, I was surprised to see a woman get out. She had cropped red hair and appeared to be in her early 40s. She was wearing a black leather jacket and walked right up to me. She smiled slightly. "Hi, you can call me Kathy. I'm from the group you've been looking for." I swallowed and rendered a quiet greeting. She didn't look threatening. I had trouble imagining what could have possessed her to join an organization like the Lost Media Group, but right now I had other things to be concerned with. "Don't worry, this isn't a setup," she reassured, reading my apprehension. "If we wanted to do you in, we could have and would have done it already." "So then, what do you want?" I interjected. "We want you to stop looking into us," she stated plainly. "And to that end, I managed to convince the higher-ups to let me show you what you've been looking for so that you and we can put this behind us." "You mean the Aristocats video?" I asked. She nodded. "For security reasons, we obviously can't just give it to you. The best I could arrange was for you to be allowed to see it, under supervision, at one of the abandoned movie theaters we used to use to give private viewings of our works for select patrons. We're about to leave that location anyway, and needless to say, you shouldn't even think about telling people you were ever there." I nodded and grunted. If it meant finally getting answers, I was willing to put up with a little more bullshit. "I hope you have the whole day free, because the theater is several hours away." I nodded again, suspecting that she already knew the answer. We got in the car and were off. We drove in silence for the first hour or so. Then I asked her why the group made lost episodes. She waited a few moments before answering. "Well, I guess you could say we aim to challenge the status quo of programming and give animators a chance to really test their limits. That's why I joined when the organization invited me." "And why do you leak them to the public if you want to keep them secret?" I prodded. "We don't leak them. Sometimes they just get out, and people who weren't intended to see them do. I don't know how you ended up seeing one of our works as a kid, but it wasn't supposed to be." "And what about the Kabetogama broadcast?" "Some member of our organization was messing around when he wasn't supposed to. Or maybe it was a TV broadcast only intended to be seen by members, back when we were a little more lax about security. Look, I said we'd show you what you've been looking for. Beyond that, I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to satisfy your curiosity about our inner workings." I was silent for a few more minutes. Her answers were suspect. The Lost Media Group seemed like the type of group that would find pleasure in shocking and traumatizing random people with their twisted works. And I didn't quite buy that all exposure to non-insiders was unintentional. I thought back to the FBI report. I also wondered if she was completely happy with the choice she had made to join the organization. Well, I've already seen part of your Aristocats edit recently, I finally said. Kathy pursed her lips, and I could see in her eyes that she was briefly considering whether it was worth trying to pretend she didn't know what I was talking about. She decided against it. Yeah, sorry about that, I guess. But I guess they figured if we gave you a good scare, you might give up and leave us alone. I was annoyed by her choice of words, as if they were the ones who only wanted to be left at peace all that time. I could only wonder if it had been her idea. I also wondered if she knew I had seen several of the other projects as well. When you visited Strobel's old studio, that was when we decided it was time to make a peace offering to get you off our back. The theater appeared to be one of those many theaters that had been opened during the 90s blockbuster boom and then abandoned during the 2000s. It was along the interstate, isolated from any other buildings. We entered through a side door Kathy had a key for. The lobby was unlit except for the sun outside. I could see a ticket counter, a concession area, and posters for old blockbusters on the wall. Covering the floor was carpeting of a faded, colorful pattern. Adjacent to the small food court was an empty room that I guessed used to be the video arcade. Kathy told me to give her my phone, which I did. She then escorted me down the gallery hallway to the last gallery. She asked me if I was sure I wanted to see this. I answered yes, and she said I could sit anywhere I wanted. I chose a seat near the back while she went up to run the projector. I began feeling scared. Sitting there in the dark, abandoned gallery was very reminiscent of sitting in the dark, watching the Aristocats all those years ago, except that all the extra space made it even more ominous. When the feature started, I could tell immediately that the audio was off. It sounded shrieky and low quality. Otherwise, the movie was normal, up until the point where the butler decided to get rid of the cats. Instead of drugging them and leaving them abandoned like in the normal movie, he drowned them in the river. It went downhill from there. Suddenly, I was a 5-year-old boy again, watching in horror as characters were mutilated, decapitated, and burned, all while strange visual and audio effects were applied. One particularly shocking scene featured real footage of cats attacking and killing a man. In real time, lines were drawn over the scene, covering it in sketchwork, until it had become a completely animated version of itself. It was done with such absolute perfection of technique that I was sure Strobel must have done that bit himself. I eventually got a grip and was able to sit through the rest of the thing calmly. It wasn't pleasant, but I was at least relieved to finally be getting it over with. When it was over, I think I had tears in my eyes. Kathy drove me back to the empty lot, and it was dark by the time we arrived. Before I got out, she spoke to me one last time. Now, listen to me. You found what you were looking for, and now that you have, you need to let it go. I took a big risk even pushing to let you in behind the scenes for that brief moment. If you continue pursuing information about our organization, you will have to take more drastic measures. We exchanged goodbyes and she drove off. For years, I kept my end of the agreement to never speak a word about our encounter to anyone. However, recently I have been reconsidering the bargain. A few days ago, someone reached out to me on the web, asking me for information on lost episodes. They claim to have seen one as a child and are hoping to find closure for their experience. I'm debating with myself whether it's worth letting them in on the secret, or if it would be better for their own sake if I convinced them they imagined the whole thing.